Welcome to The Healthy Shift Worker, the podcast inspiring shift workers to be the healthiest versions possible whilst working around the clock 24/7. Here's your host, Audra Starkey.
Hi everyone, welcome back to today's episode of the Healthy Shift Worker podcast. Today I'm talking with Cameron Borg, who is a qualified nutritionist, pulmonary scientist, podcaster and health coach based here in Australia in Sydney. Cameron has spent the last decade learning about why our health is deteriorating and what we need to do in order to mend it. Having worked with hundreds of clients on the health, a part that I really resonated with, to allow them to build and optimize their health from the ground up. I'd like to shout out a warm, healthy shift worker welcome to Cameron. Thank you for joining me today.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
So it's really nice to have a fellow nutritionist on the podcast, Cameron. And something, though, that I've noticed with you, having listened to a few of your own podcasts and different conversations, is that you have taken a little bit of a different path, which is similar to myself, and that you have a very inquisitive mind, that you really sort of think outside the box. This is why I really wanted to get you on the podcast today, because I know that you can certainly share an assortment of different information with us. But I guess before we dive into the conversation, would you mind sharing a little bit about your journey, how you came to be doing what you're doing right now?
Yeah, so I was sort of forced into an inquisitive mindset and trying to look outside the box because I've had a history of being quite ill. I was very ill as a child, sort of grew out of that in my teens, but was always a bit more susceptible to illness than everyone else around me. And over a period of time and several things happened that made me very disillusioned with the way that conventional medicine was practiced. And I basically realized I had to take it into my own hands and sort of opt out of that way of doing things. And nutrition was one of the things or the first thing that really grasped my attention. I became very, very interested in the way that, it seems obvious when you say it, but food, the things you eat can change the way your body works. And that was something I'd never really thought about until I started to get quite interested into these interactions between food and health outcomes. And I just basically got so interested that I was like, I have to study this. So I went to university. And about 1 year into my course, I began to realize that there were things that were far, far more important than nutrition that played bigger roles in health outcomes than just the foods we ate. And I was experiencing that myself because I was dealing with health problems that I was trying to treat with diet only, and it just didn't work. I was forced down this path of saying, well, what else is there? And came across work that was basically saying, well, nutrition only makes sense in the context of these broader elements. And circadian rhythm was one of the first thing that really took me by surprise, in the fact that what you eat can only really make sense in the context of where you eat it. And this work was done and is currently being done predominantly by guys like Sachin Panda, who show that eating the same foods but just in a different time frame have broadly different metabolic effects. And that was really interesting, thinking that, well, okay, it's not just the food. The broader context is probably more important than the food itself. And it was very obvious to me that basically if you ate a whole food diet, you were like 90% of the way there. And even when you do that, that's not always going to yield good results. So it became very apparent to me that if you want to really help people, yes, diet is a part of that, but it's a relatively small portion of that. And I got the best results in myself, really curating my exposure to the environmental influences that guide circadian rhythms. And that was when I sort of decided to put the nutrition aspect away. I felt like I had learned a sufficient amount to really get me through. I feel like I'm not a specialist in food and nutrition. I'm a generalist, and I'm more than happy with that. I probably know more than I need to know as far as the nutrition is concerned. And yeah, I just got really interested in all of these other aspects, the context around which food is eaten that made more sense to me and it had more explanatory power with regard to the chronic disease epidemics we're seeing today. I don't think you can easily explain that with food alone. There are so many other things going on that have better explanatory power than the food problem alone. So it was more just integrating what I learned or what I was interested in into a broader context. And that really started my adventure outside of the realm of nutrition, started with this circadian idea. You know, I was wearing those old blue blocking glasses. I think I my first pair in like 2017 or something. So I was a very early adopter, and you know, people thought I was stupid or had a special condition that required me to wear the colored glasses. But I realized very early on that one of the biggest departures we'd had in the last century from our natural state was our light environment. And I didn't really grasp it that much at the time, but I knew enough that I had to protect my vision in that sense. So that was really the very beginnings of my delving into things that were beyond nutrition.
I really love that, and I can personally relate to what you're saying, because when I was doing my nutrition degree as well, I felt that there were elements that were missing from that degree. And I also realized quickly that it wasn't all about food, especially with my niche of shift workers. I realized, actually, you know what? Sleep is more important than nutrition. So it's like I need to instead of putting the cart before the horse, so to speak, we need to work out in a particular order in order to be able to get our clients the best results. And another thing was I also stemmed down the chrono and circadian thing, which is a huge area that you've touched on as well. So I love that you have that taking a bigger step back picture to grasp ways to really be able to get the best results for our clients. One thing that I also felt that it was refreshing to hear is that even despite you having gut or having experienced gut issues, Cameron, you do say that you're not against grains and legumes. Can you touch on that as well?
That's easy. We've been eating grains and legumes for well over 10,000 years. The issues with gastrointestinal disorders have only really reached fevered peak in the last few decades, I would say. So, you know, and I understand the arguments about, well, we have selectively bred wheat in a certain way. I understand that, and that's important. That's not to say I'm going out eating white bread every day. I certainly am not. But to blame GI problems on that is such a surface level way to look at it. And the reality is, when you get the foundational things right, I find myself saying this a lot at the moment, when you prioritize the things that have changed the most and try and get back to a more natural, I refrain from using the word ancestral, but I will use it here in a literal sense, get back to a more ancestral environment, and whether that includes the circadian, the light environment, the electromagnetic environment. Those things are going to give you the biggest bang for your buck. And this whole, you know, idea about grains and legumes, they're bad for the gut. You know, I went to Europe last year and I gave myself a free pass to eat whatever I want. And I was eating conventional pastries, so not organic, so had high residues of pesticides. They were raised with industrial yeast. They weren't sourdough. And being in Europe, I never felt, my gut was never better eating all the crap that I wanted. And that was probably because we were outside all day. We were walking around exploring these beautiful places all over Europe. And we were so tired by the end of the day when the sun went down, we got straight into bed and we slept, and we woke up first thing in the morning to start the exploring again. So to me, it's like to blame things on food, and we've got all these people out there saying grains are bad, oats are bad, this and that. That is an immediate sign to me that person is not looking at the right level of analysis. They're not looking at the things that matter most. And I think a lot of people have the same experience that I did. You know, going somewhere like Europe and eating all the things that everyone says are bad for them and never feeling better. It is just interesting to me that can happen, because it disproves this idea that, you know, grains and legumes are inherently bad. We've been eating them for a very, very, very long time, and never before have they caused us issues. I think the pesticide residue is probably the main issue.
Yeah.
because those foods have the highest level of pesticide. But at the end of the day, I think people will get the best results with their gastrointestinal issues from uh, essentially rising with the sun
Mm.
and going to sleep when the sun goes down and getting enough natural light onto their body. That's certainly been the experience with myself. I've had gut issues my entire life, and it's only normalized in the last few years since I've actually started to take all of this on board. And it's made a much bigger difference than any diet or food or eating pattern has ever made. So that's sort of my opinion. If someone's focusing on something like grains or legumes or nuts and seeds or whatever, they're just not looking deep enough. I'm not saying that there's no value in eliminating grains and legumes at certain periods of time for certain periods of time, but at the same time, it's not deep enough, and that's really why I try not to go into the food debate very much at all, because
Mm.
there's so much more to be explored that's going to get you so much more results than saying, oh, which should I be eating gluten or avoiding gluten, sourdough this. It's just it's not the level that I want to go at, because I don't think people get the benefit that they deserve at that level of analysis.
Yeah, brilliant. And I think definitely Europe, we do hear that story a lot when people we head off to Europe, and we're also usually on holidays as well. We're relaxed. But as you said, we're eating the stuff that people think is a bit of a no-no. And I used to kind of sit uncomfortably with me, I suppose, even when I was taught it through uni about FODMAPs. And I'm thinking, but even that's an element of stress that we're putting on our clients to be so restrictive, but we're not looking at, as you said, how much sleep they're getting, how much exposure to artificial light that they're doing, because it's like you're putting on a handbrake to getting results if you're not taking in that beautiful big picture perspective. So leading into that, I know that I listened to a podcast recently with Dr. Max Goldhain on his fantastic regenerative podcast, and you were talking about how the electromagnetic and light environment is way more important on food, and you've just touched on it briefly. Could you just go into a little bit more detail with that with us?
I made that claim on the premise of, if you think, what have the biggest changes in our environment been over the last 100 years? The biggest by far is the electromagnetic environment, because we have signals that never existed before. Hard stop. They were not there. So, it's not at all like food, where selective breeding might change it 20%. It might change the constituents, and that's a big estimate. This has gone from zero to, anything. 0 times a million is still zero. So, we never had any of these signals in the past, and now we are swimming in them all the time. So that was the basis of what I was saying there, is that we should investigate the effects of these electromagnetic fields on our health. And because the Earth generates its own electromagnetic fields, and they're very, very subtle, extremely low energy fields, and because we've evolved with them, our bodies are exquisitely sensitive, and they work in a non-linear fashion, which means that applying more energy into the system does not necessarily yield worse results as far as health outcomes. So that's what we mean by non-linear effects, is that the more you're exposed doesn't necessarily mean things are worse. So you can get really bad, you can get significant biological shift from very, very low energy interactions with electromagnetic fields. And this is what's sort of lost in biochemistry a little bit, is this fact that the body is not this linear machine. It's not a one-to-one relationship with what comes in and what comes out. And this is the same that I think Max and I touched on this as well with non-linear optics, which our body uses to take light in from the external environment and basically shift it around and emit light of a different wavelength. And that is, again, the basis of what you get in is not necessarily what you get out. And we know, for instance, bringing it back to what we were talking about with gut health, we know that single-celled organisms are exquisitely sensitive to electromagnetic fields. And there are very interesting studies showing that the growth of certain pathogenic microbes on petri dishes is significantly affected by 2.4 gigahertz radiation, which is Wi-Fi signals. And they tend to become more upset and they grow more rapidly in those states, probably because what's happening is they're being stressed by the non-native, the man-made electromagnetic field. And I suspect this is also happening with regard to things like mold growth in houses. I suspect that houses that are near power lines or that have Wi-Fi signals, if you're in an apartment complex, for instance, and everyone has their own Wi-Fi signal, it seems to me that that would stress the fungal communities so that they might grow faster. And I suspect this sort of thing is happening in the gut where, we have to think these non-native electromagnetic fields are going straight through us. That's why Wi-Fi routers can go through walls. That's why the signal, you don't have to be right next to it for it to work. It's going straight through us. And it is probably having quite a big impact on the gut microbiome. And we don't know what the impact of that is. This is also just me speculating. I'm not saying I've read any direct evidence for this, but we do know microbes their activity is quite significantly perturbed by man-made electromagnetic signals. And we have to think, what impact is that having on our digestion? What impact is that having on the metabolites that all of our bacteria in our gut are making? And I think this comes back to the problem with science at the moment is it's very difficult to study these things because immediately you're looked at like a crazy person if you're suggesting that your Wi-Fi router might be causing your GI issues. Or I shouldn't say causing, might be contributing to your GI issues, or for any issue for that matter, because like I said, these nonlinear effects that we see in electromagnetic fields don't necessarily yield the same outcomes all the time. One person might get some sort of pathological event happen from exposure, whereas someone might get something completely different from the exact same exposure. And that makes it extremely difficult to study this because there is no cause and effect. We do not have this, hypothetical, magical, X equals Y. That is not how biology works. That's how mathematics works. And this reductionistic scientism that says, well, if there's no linear pathway from cause to effect, then there is no way you can prove what is going on. And I think that's really what is hindering the research in this area. It's particularly now that it was a bit more fertile decades ago when these questions were first being asked. But we're so far down the line now. It's just it's assumed that these non-native electromagnetic fields are safe. And like I said, the main reason I brought that up was because it is the biggest change in our environment over the last century, and it would be silly not to call that into question with regard to any illness that we're having, because it makes sense to invoke that because it is the biggest change in our environment. And whether or not that's having as big an impact as I might think personally, we don't know. But it is certainly something we need to look into, and part of that electromagnetic spectrum is light, which immediately goes back to the circadian story. And I wanted to bring up the 2017 Nobel Prize, which went to Jeffrey Hall, Michael Young, and Michael Rosbash, about the genetic and molecular mechanisms that control the circadian clocks, because it's been known for a very long time that organisms can maintain their circadian rhythm in complete darkness. Now, the problem with that is if there is no entrainment of the circadian rhythm by light exposure, the assumption was there had to be some biochemical mechanism that regulated it. And this was sort of painted out in this big picture of all of these different genetic cascades, the period genes, BMAL, the clock genes, all of these things are playing together, orchestrating the circadian rhythmicity of all of the genetic expression that was happening throughout the day. We know the latest estimates say that 85% of our coding genome is circadian, which means that it exhibits periods of activity and rest. 85%, I wouldn't be surprised if that increases over the next few years of research. I would suspect that probably something closer to 99% of genetic expression is regulated on periods of on cyclic patterns. But the problem with that is, and I suspect if you did these same experiments with organisms in complete darkness and see if they could regulate their circadian rhythms if they were in darkness and in a Faraday cage, I suspect the results would not be the same, because we know electromagnetic fields are also playing a role in regulation of circadian rhythm. And the problem with looking at it from a biochemical angle is it's too narrow a lens to understand what's going on. And this is something that I have been very interested in recently, is the idea that molecular biology and biochemistry in general is so zoomed in, is not far back enough to understand what is really going on in biology. You cannot understand biology from the level of biochemistry. It's like trying to understand what a house looks like just by examining what the bricks are. You will never understand what the house looks like, even if you know exactly the constituents of the brick. You will never understand. And I think that's what is happening here with biochemistry. And looking at these genetic and molecular mechanisms, is they're missing the broader picture. And I suspect, like I said, if you get organisms in a Faraday cage in darkness, they will not exhibit the same circadian rhythmicity. They will not be able to couple those things together, because even without light, you are still exposed to the native fields of the earth, which I suspect are playing quite a significant role in circadian biology. So I would love to see something like that done, where not only do you take the light cues away and see if the circadian rhythm stays intact or shifts very slowly, also do it in a Faraday cage, see what happens. And this would be very easy to do, because you could do it with single-celled organisms, or you could do it with very simple models of Drosophila or something like that. It would be very easy to test, I would think. But again, biochemistry and molecular biology don't take that into account. And I think that's a really important thing to think about when we think about circadian regulation of genetic expression, is that it's not happening on the level of biochemistry. That's important, but what is regulating the biochemistry? That's what we need to start looking into. And I don't think we'll get a really clear understanding of what circadian rhythm really is until we take a step back and go, look, what is controlling these molecular mechanisms? Because these things can't just happen on their own. Like I said, it's like the house and the brick analogy. If you're just focusing on the brick, you'll never understand how the house was built, or what it looks like, or the structural components of the house. You'll just know what it's made of, which is fine. It's a part of the story, but it's a very small part of the story. And I realized I've been ranting for quite a while, but that's just because my mind has been swimming with these ideas for a little while now. So yeah, sorry if I went on too long there.
No. It's you're hitting the nail on the head. I think again, out of your inquisitive mind, you don't just take things as black and white. It's like there's more to this picture. There's something not quite right going on. So which leads me on to my next question. With shift workers, unfortunately, for myriad of different reasons, they are prone to things like type 2 diabetes and obesity. And I noticed that you shared you spoke briefly about a rat study. And of course, we need to understand that not all animal studies can be replicated in human trials. But it was quite interesting that it showed, I just had to read it here again, that there was damage to the islet cells of the pancreas in these rats that were exposed to Wi-Fi. Now, I thought that was powerful, because we're not even going down to the topic of food.
Oh, absolutely. And this is where I think conventional medicine just completely has missed the boat here. We don't take this stuff into consideration. And, I work in a hospital, and I see, we live in a part of Sydney that has a very high Sri Lankan Indian population. And a lot of them are vegetarians and have been since birth. And these are the classic skinny fat. They are thin, but they have the worst. They have the most dysregulated lipids. They have the highest hemoglobin A1Cs. And you look at them, and they're thin, and they're vegetarian, and you think, how can this happen? And all of them, they have dark skin, so they need more sunlight to control all the things that are going on in their body, to control their immune system, to regulate their blood lipids, to regulate all of the things that are going on inside the mitochondria. And, you just wonder, how are these guys so sick? They're thin. Why do they have the worst diabetes, type 2 diabetes I've ever seen? And it's because they live inside, and a lot of them work around computers, and they're stuck around them all day. And, you just think you see, and I know it is a rat study, and I know it's very difficult to extrapolate from that, but the fact that, that's sort of a canary in the coal mine for me, and there's no reason to suggest that wouldn't happen in humans. But yeah, the damage to the islet cells is really important, because for people who don't know, those islet cells in the pancreas are what generate insulin, which is a key hormone in regulating energy metabolism. And the death of those cells is eventually what causes the need for insulin in type 2 diabetics. When it gets advanced enough, you actually need to inject your own insulin because your pancreas ceases to work. And this is a big question that we should be asking. And like I said, it is our electromagnetic environment is the biggest shift in the last 100 years that we've had. This should be the first investigation of every doctor. What is your electromagnetic environment like? Because it doesn't, you cannot make sense of it from a dietary point of view. It doesn't make any sense if all you had was the dietary point of view. And yeah, even the fact that they have dark skin, which leaves them, we know the darker the skin, the more sunlight you need to generate the same benefits as people with lighter skin. And this is one of the reasons why people with darker skin who have moved further away from the equator tend to do worse in all health metrics. And this is what we're seeing. Even here in Sydney, the light intensity is not as strong as it would be in the south of India or Sri Lanka, for that matter.
Yeah,
it's just not as strong. And even if they are getting outside for 10, 15 minutes with their arms exposed, it's simply not enough to control these broader things that are going on. And yeah, that rat study that I shared a little while ago about the destruction of the islet cells is just a piece of that puzzle. And what I'm trying to do is just bring as many pieces to the puzzle forward as I can to try and help myself make sense of what's going on. And I think this is something that needs to be investigated more. But it wouldn't surprise me at all if this type of exposure is an important part of the diabetes metabolic syndrome thing that's going on in record rates around the world.
and the thing is, we can't see this, can we? So we think that it's harmless, unfortunately.
Yep.
It's not an obvious thing that A plus B is causing C. You can't see kind of B. So we just dismiss it straight away. It's no, that couldn't possibly, or they wouldn't put us in harm's way. Yeah. So just circling back a little bit towards the light, Cameron, could you, I guess, go into some of the mechanisms behind how lack of light could also be causing some of our type 2 diabetes and obesity epidemic? Because we know we definitely need more of that full spectrum sunlight, but we've kind of got this darkness deficiency going on as well. So there's kind of two parts to the story. Could you mind just sharing a little bit more about your insights and some of maybe the research that you've kind of come across with that?
I'll put it this way. I'll try not to cite research to make it as easy as possible, because I think it gets into the weeds a little bit too much. Think about it. Think about it from an evolutionary point of view. We evolved every single day outside, exposed to the broad spectrum of light. Now remember, most of the light that's coming from the sun is invisible to us. So it makes it very difficult, because of the quirks of vision, it makes it a little bit more difficult to understand how we've gone so wrong. So you might think, looking at a light bulb in your house, you might think that pretty much resembles the light that's coming from the sun. And that's just because our vision is lying to us. Well, it's not lying to us. It had no reason to tell us anything else as we were evolving. And the reality is that light that you have in your house resembles almost nothing like the sun. It is nothing like the sun at all. First of all, it's a narrowband emitter because it works on semiconduction. And the sun is anything from a narrowband emitter. It is an extreme broadband emitter. So we get that part of the story wrong. But because we can use the three primary colors, semiconductors that produce the three primary colors, we can make light look like it's white. Now, our eyes never needed to discern narrowband emission from broadband emission. So to us, it looks relatively, and this made it very easy for the progression of, the incandescent bulb to the fluorescent tube to the halogen to the fluorescent tube and finally to the LED. They all basically look quite similar to the undiscerning eye. And that's because that's the way our vision evolved. We had no reason to distinguish between narrowband and broadband emission because in nature there is no narrowband emission. Everything is broadband. We spend our entire day, every single day of our whole life, outside exposed to particularly these long wavelengths. Now remember, even if it is the most cloudy, rainy, thunderstormy day, all of that near infrared is bouncing through those water molecules because water doesn't absorb near infrared very well. It's bouncing through and it's coming out basically unimpeded. So we are being bathed, even on the cloudiest, stormiest, rainiest day, we are being bathed in near infrared light that we cannot see. And it is very, very broad. All of that light is basically still coming through, and it's very, very bright. You might even think that it's not that bright, but go outside, even on a stormy day, look directly up after you've been inside for a couple of hours. You'll have to squint really hard because that's our body trying to adjust to the massive shift in light intensity as well. So we evolved exposed to this light all day long. As soon as the sun went down, we basically had none until we invented fire. And even then, fire is a broadband emitter, and it primarily emits in the near infrared and the infrared. So these are invisible wavelengths that have a much less detrimental profile than the short wavelengths that have a much higher energy in the photon than the long wavelengths. So fire is not nearly as bad as the lights that we use today. It's probably the most. It still disturbs circadian rhythm because it is light after dark, but its profile is much more favorable than any sort of man-made light. So when we detach ourselves from this evolutionary basis of being exposed to sunlight all day, every day for our entire life, remember our body evolved expecting that to happen every single day. Rain, hail, or shine, it expected it. So it had no fallback mechanism to go, well, what happens if we're indoors all day? Never needed a fallback mechanism. Now, what we experience today is essentially a population that spends 90% of their time indoors, away from the basic things that forged our entire physiology. Now, the reason that multicellular organisms, the mitochondria, this endosymbiotic event of an archaea swallowing a bacterium and then becoming parasitic but then symbiotic. And this mitochondria that we have, or these thousands in every single cell, basically are light receptacles. And particularly they receive the long wavelength light that we get from the sun that's invisible, that we have completely eliminated. I'm not just talking about we've limited in our man-made light, we have completely eliminated it. And like I said before, because of the quirks of our vision, we have not even noticed. We have no earthly idea, but our mitochondria do, our cells do, because those long wavelengths are basically what help spin the cycle of energy within our cells. Now, when you limit the amount of energy that the mitochondria can make, essentially any pathology can come from that. And this is what we were saying before with electromagnetic energy. Not necessarily, you can expose different people to the same exposure vector and two different things happen. This was proven beyond a shadow of a doubt by Becker and Marino with their rat studies. Mm-hmm. And in Going Somewhere, Marino's book, he explains very eloquently why the legal system was unable to comprehend why different effects came from the same exposure vector. And that's why we never got any headway with basically limiting the amount of electromagnetic energy that was put into the environment, because no one could make sense of that fact, this non-linear these nonlinear effects. And like I said, when you limit the basic fundamental expected energy from the mitochondria, you can get any sort of pathology from that, because depending on all of the other environmental inputs, you can result in type 2 diabetes, it can result in specific types of cancers, it can result in neurodegeneration. The focal point of all of those things, all of these chronic disability, chronic illnesses that we're seeing today, at the core of them are mitochondrial dysfunction. Now, when sunlight is specifically there to make sure the mitochondria work well, when it is gone, you don't necessarily get one illness. You get a broad array of all of these different illnesses because everyone is experiencing different other aspects of the environment. And this is why it's so difficult for the scientific establishment to get around the fact that exposure to sunlight is linked to everything. And that's why you look at Pelle Lindqvist's work, the melanoma in southern Sweden cohort. Sunlight exposure patterns, the more sunlight you got, it reduced all-cause mortality. It didn't just reduce metabolic syndrome. It didn't just reduce neurodegeneration. It reduced all-cause mortality. And this is, remember what I said before, our cells expect full-spectrum sunlight all day, every single day, and it expects it to be gone essentially when the sun goes down. We have completely detached from that, completely. And the problem is we don't just get one, there's not one disease that happens from that. It's everything. Everything is affected. And it is impossible for reductionistic science to comprehend this and come to the conclusion that the broader environmental exposures don't just cause one thing, they contribute to everything. And I can't really remember the question that you asked me, and I went on a pretty big tangent, but the fact is, we have to remember our cells expect this. And if we do not have it, we better do our very best to try and replicate that as best we can. And a lot of that just comes to changing the way we live our lives, going to bed earlier when the sun goes down, waking up earlier when the sun comes up, taking more breaks from work to get outside. What I do, I work in a hospital. On lunch, I run down to the park and I take my shirt off and I take my shoes off. It's not perfect because I'm inside a really crappy environment in the hospital. But
I love that. I remember going to a holistic GP, probably about 15 years ago, and he was saying the same thing, that, during his lunch break, he recommends like going outside and taking the shirt off. Well, that's what he does. And I went, well, that might work for you, but it won't work for me. I'll start getting a few funny looks if I was to take my shirt off in the middle of the day. But I understood where he was going with that. But yeah, I suppose again, circling back to that question, and thank you so much for going through it so thoroughly, because there is no simple answer to some of these questions that I'm asking, obviously. But for those of because just when working with my own clients, I'm trying very hard to kind of guide them towards the importance of sunlight or sun exposure when it comes to weight loss. And unfortunately, it probably, undeniably, it's not helping when we get these messages coming through from the Cancer Council Foundation saying that there is no safe tan. But for any of our listeners that are maybe experiencing struggles with their weight, they've tried all different types of things, what would you tell them? And I suppose in the simplistic sort of a mechanism to help for them to understand how important it really is. This is not just some pseudoscience scenario. This is real life stuff. We need to be getting outdoors more. It's not just about the food.
I guess with regard to weight loss, our body is, I think weight gain and even to the extent of insulin resistance and type 2 diabetes is a very important evolutionary adaptation. It's not your body making a mistake. That is your body doing exactly what it should be doing based on the signals that you're giving it. Think about what happens in summer when carbohydrates are available. What do you want to do? You want to store fat. Your body wants to do these things. It wants to become insulin resistant. Why? Because you need to do that to survive winter. Type 2 diabetes is not a mistake on the part of the body. It is the body doing exactly what it thinks it needs to do to survive. Now, what you need to do is give it the right signal and tell it how to regulate itself. The body will do exactly what it's supposed to do, but it has to get the right signal.
Yeah.
And weight gain is just the perfect example. Like the fact that somewhere close to 50% of the population in Australia is overweight. I mean, that just represents the fact that the environmental inputs are wrong, and it's telling our bodies the wrong thing. To assume that the body is making a mistake, I think is one of the biggest grievances you can have, because the body knows exactly what to do. You just have to give it the right signals and the right tools to do so. And nutrition plays a role in that. I'm not going to say that food doesn't matter. Of course it matters. But does it matter as much as getting your light environment dialed in as best you can? Does it matter as much as getting your light environment as close to natural as possible? I don't think it does. And, I think a lot of people who have issues losing weight have the experience of, starving themselves, eating nothing but never losing weight. That is the body doing exactly what you're telling it to do based on the environment that you're in. It is a constant blue light environment that goes long into the night, and arguably night has been completely taken away from us because of street lighting coming through windows. People have clocks in their rooms and all sorts of gadgets and gizmos. We have lost darkness, and it's just telling our bodies, it's summer, put on weight. You need to survive. So the signaling from the environment is really the important thing to take into consideration. Your body's not making a mistake. There is nothing wrong with your genetics. I hate when people use genetics as an excuse, because it basically removes your responsibility from what is going on, and it makes you a victim. We are not victims. We just need to give the body what it needs. It doesn't make mistakes. It just does what it needs to do to survive. And the environmental inputs are what guide that.
Yeah, I really love that too. And I think we can beat ourselves up thinking our body's attacking us and all this kind of thing, which opens up the whole conversation about autoimmune, which I know we haven't got really time for. That's a whole podcast in its own outright. Something doesn't sit right for me when they're sort of insinuating that the body is attacking itself. I don't believe the body would actually do that. It doesn't. Intuitively, it doesn't make sense. As you said, the body's always
It's not a mistake.
Yeah, it's always out to protect you, to keep you alive in sort of from a survival mechanism scenario. So, I really enjoy your take on that. So, I've got two more questions to ask. And I guess one, because some of our listeners are in the likes of living in Canada, Northern Europe, up as far as Alaska. They don't have the luxury that we do here in Australia when they get plenty of sunlight. What advice can you give to those people? And are they getting, I know you alluded to before about being able to come through clouds and so forth. What do those people do that they're pretty much coming and going in darkness, not just because of their job working 12 hours? What sort of advice can you give to those people?
So I'm not an expert on this. This is something that I've been thinking about quite intensely for a while now, because you're right. The light environment here in Sydney I take for granted, and it's certainly not the same thing that you get in Oslo, in Norway, for instance, because in winter there's almost a couple of hours of sunlight, and then the rest is darkness. And converse, in the summer it's almost light all the time. So how do they make it work? Well, we know, for instance, that the people in those countries have better health outcomes than we do here in the West. So clearly they can make it work. I suspect they have specific adaptations because they are a more homogeneous population over there, so that their adaptations to those types of environments are probably a bit more robust than we have here, because in Australia we're very mixed in. Like, I have Maltese heritage from my father and British from my mum, so it's sort of mixed in a little bit more. And I think living closer to the equator affords you that buffer, because you can sort of dial things in a little bit easier. Makes it easier to understand the role of circadian rhythm and how to use sunlight in that way. But yeah, people in northern Canada, northern Canada, or even northern Europe, where the gradient is quite strong, the salient points remain the same, that you need to be outside, because those light signals are still there. Remember, You may not see them. They're invisible, but they are still there. And the beauty of long wavelength light, like infrared and near infrared, is that it goes straight through clothes. It is not, it's basically transparent clothes to these wavelengths. So even if you're in big puffy jackets, get outside because you are still getting the benefits. And there's great photos by a good friend of mine, Bob Fosbury. We're using a broadband emitter of near infrared light, and he put 6 layers of clothing between that and his near infrared camera, and it goes through everything like it's clear glass. It is completely transparent to these two clothes. So even if you're outside wearing a balaclava and you're covered from head to toe, get outside. You just have to be outside. Do not be a zoo animal, because the moment you go inside the walls, there is no near infrared, there is no infrared. And unfortunately, most developed countries have outlawed the incandescent light bulb, which would have been our only source of those long wavelengths of light indoors. I think I strongly believe we need to get that back in. That's probably the biggest healthcare mistake that's ever been made, and I don't say that lightly. But you have to get outside, and you have to try and form a pattern of sleep and wake that is consistent and follows the seasons. Consistency is key. Going to bed at the same time, waking up at roughly the same time every day is really, really key. Even if you don't have the robust light signals that we have here, there's a clear sunrise, a clear sunset. In other parts of the world, that's not there. So what you have to do is just try and be consistent, and remember, you still have to get outside because those signals are still there, even though you can't see them with your eye. But yeah, it is interesting. For instance, the Sami people of northern Sweden and Finland, they are herders, and they would sleep when their deer or reindeer or whatever it was. I think it was reindeer that they herd. They would sleep when the reindeer were sleeping, and when the reindeer got up and decided to move, they would have to wake up and go along with them. So their activity and rest cycles were completely different, because they were, sleeping for 2 hours, getting up when the reindeer moved, and then sleeping another few hours, and then, and they seemed to do okay. So, there are big questions around northern living that we don't really understand at the moment. And I wish I could give you a better answer as to what's really going on there. But the fact of the matter is that people in those northern parts of the world where the circadian cycles are a bit different than we have on the equator, their health metrics are better than ours in a lot of places. So, clearly there are ways to deal with it. We just need to basically live as close to the natural environment that we're in as we can. That's the best way to try and cope with that.
Yeah, certainly we sound like us Westerners need to be doing a bit more research on our Scandinavian friends. And
no doubt there is work being done, but it's just I haven't had time to look for it.
Yeah. But I think that it's helpful advice, Cameron, because even though, despite what you were saying about getting up at the same time every day and going to bed at the same time, as a shift worker, that only happens on our days off or when we're on holidays. Unfortunately, it is what it is. But it's prioritizing those times on your days off and doing what you can to help recalibrate that reset that circadian rhythm back to normality as much as possible. When you aren't working. And I know. And I love the advice that you've said, even for those that do live in the northern parts of America, is even if it is cold and that outside, as hard as it would be, I know it would be hard for me because I'm a cold frog, but to be going outside, it is, you are getting some benefits, the fresh air, the away from the work, like what you do in the hospital environment. You're removing yourself from your workplace. It helps to reset. It offers so many benefits. I guess so. In order just to wrap up, I'm just mindful of your time, Cameron. If you were to give, I guess, 3 tips for our shift workers, and maybe from a order of priority. No doubt you do see shift workers yourself working in a hospital environment. Some of your clients would be. If you were to give them, maybe 3 tips and perhaps an order of priority, what sort of general advice would you recommend to them?
My general advice, first piece of advice, and this may sound somewhat dispassionate, but at the end of the day, I think your first priority should be to work as hard as you can to get out. Unless it is a job, that is actually your calling.
Yeah.
And no doubt there will be people where nursing or ambulance working is absolutely their calling, and we need people like that. If your job is shift working and it is not your calling, work as hard as you can to get out, because you are inevitably damaging your health in some way, shape, or form. For the people who it is their calling and it is what they want to do, and I salute you, really, because we need people like that. The earth won't, our modern society won't work without a lot of these jobs, and we should be extremely thankful for them. I guess my tip for them is consistency. You need to work with your managers, with your bosses, to have as consistent a pattern of work as you possibly can. You don't want to be doing 7 a.m. starts for 3 days and then 6 p.m. starts for 3 days and then going back and forth. That's the worst thing you can do. You need to try and work with the people around you to organize trying to get long periods of time where you're on the same schedule. And that consistency is so key. And during that schedule, you're going to want to time your food intake very, very closely. You're going to want to time your light exposures as closely as you can, and you're going to want to use things like blue blockers. You're going to want to wear long sleeve shirts and long sleeve pants and try and cover up your skin, because it's easy to forget that our non-visual photoreceptors are also on our skin. So blue blockers are not even enough to protect your circadian rhythm. If you're getting narrowband blue on the skin, I suspect that is doing the same thing that it's doing when it comes in your eye, because you've got melanopsin on your skin. So cover up your skin, cover up your eyes at the adjusted correct circadian period. Meal timing is important, sleep timing is important, and no doubt that's going to be extremely difficult. But it's something you're going to have to really try and do. And beyond that, I don't even think I have a third tip. I think consistency is so important with regard to, I'm sure you will have shared many other tips that are actionable, but off the top of my head, really, if your calling is to work in a shift working place, consistency and just trying to get into the best circadian habit you possibly can, that is going to reduce the negative impacts of shift working as much as it possibly could. And that's what's most important, is we want to balance those risks and rewards as best we can. And beyond that, I mean, it's kind of up to you. And I used to do shift working when I finished school. I remember finishing at every Friday. I used to do 5 p.m. to 3 a.m. and it was a nightmare. It totally ruined my health. And yeah, it was really, really difficult, because I wasn't doing that same shift every day. It was all over the place. So I have some appreciation of how difficult it is. And if shift working is not your calling, work as hard as you can to find something else to do, because your health and your longevity will thank you. I guess how much time have we got? Before we go, I wouldn't mind reading something that I've been working on from a bigger project, because sometimes it's difficult for me to really wrap my head around what I'm actually trying to say. So I'm going to read something, if that's okay.
No, go for it.
Evolutionarily, light has been the anchor of biology. It is the primary environmental input that determines periods of activity and rest, and is ultimately the primary vector for the limits of biological systems. When it is absent, organisms must change their activities accordingly, or risk potentially lethal limitations in energy metabolism. The stimulus of constant and reliable light-dark cycles drove the evolution of circadian rhythms. Circadian rhythms are the roughly 24-hour cycles of activity and rest that are essentially exhibited by all organisms. These cycles govern countless physiological functions, including alertness, strength, hormonal secretion, uresis, thermoregulation, and even nasal dilation. The Earth's light-dark cycles have been so reliable and unchanging that biology cemented it as the foundation upon which it functions. The sun has always risen and set every single day since the earth formed. Imagine that 24-hour rhythms of night and day are analogous to hardware. If any new biological system, software, came along, it would have to be programmed according to the constraints of the hardware. This analogy could essentially be used for any component of the environment, but light-dark cycles are particularly broad-reaching and an important element. So that is the distillation of what I'm trying to get across here, is that the body expects these circadian rhythms so much to the point that it is cemented at the foundation of biology across the board. And any time we have to think about something, it has to be thought of in the context of the cement in which it's resting in, which is the circadian rhythm. And I like to think of it as the anchor of biology. Everything has to flow through a circadian point to make sense. So that's sort of the distillation of my thinking with regard to circadian rhythm.
Yeah, and that really excites me, because the whole circadian timing system is something that I've certainly delved down a lot in the last 12 months, and that explains it to a T, and we have to scratch our heads. Why is circadian health not one of the first things that doctors talk about when it comes to a whatever ailment that you're suffering from? As you said before, like kind of light controls everything. Light and darkness controls every little pretty much every tissue, cell and organ in our body, and to ignore it and not talk about it and not to address that is missing the whole foundations of that table. So you can keep throwing paint, it's like throwing paint at a wall or something, and it keeps falling down. It's going to keep falling down until you. And Cameron, I do appreciate your honesty when you were saying about, you know, for shift work, if you can get out of it, get out of it. And to be honest, I do now really appreciate that, having sort of 10 years down the track now, learning what I learn. I do appreciate that. And it's certainly, I kind of get a bit frustrated when I hear some people say that they can really thrive working shift work. I don't believe that. And it's why my book says in brackets, surviving, because I think that's what we are doing. But it's doing what we possibly can to survive, because we are not meant to be working shift work. However, yes, as you said as well, like the world would kind of come to a halt if we didn't have shift workers. So we need to be doing whatever we possibly can to help support them. And and definitely addressing the light is a big one. And you've said it yourself about, you work in a hospital environment. Imagine how much better it would be if we looked at the hospital setting straight away and changed the lighting in there, reduced all the pinging and noises and buzzing and having to wake up patients at 2, 4 o'clock in the morning to take medications. Really, wouldn't that start to improve the health and well-being of those patients? But I guess, it's a big conversation, and I know that it's, a bit of politics and money behind the reasons why we see what we do. But I really appreciate your insights, Cameron. I guess, is there anything that you wanted to add before we go that I might have missed?
You wrapped it up very, very well. And I just want to reiterate the point that, yes, we do need shift workers, and we should be very grateful for them. But yes, at the end of the day, I don't want to mince my words. If you can get out, that should be your first priority, because we need to protect the health of people in our community, because we don't know how much they could contribute if they were operating at their peak capacity. And the more people we can get whose minds and bodies are working really well, the better things are going to be for everyone. And it's going to save us money from our healthcare costs. It's going to save the taxpayer. Look, there are very, very intelligent and caring people looking into this, primarily working with architects, believe it or not. I think that's where the rubber meets the road here. We're going to have to speak to the people who are actually designing the buildings to get them to actually start the change. That's ground zero. And guys like Glenn Jeffrey, Professor Glenn Jeffrey, and Bob Fosbury and Scott Zimmerman, all previous guests on my podcast, I know they are in very, very close conversations with architects and even quantum biologists at the moment to try and understand how we can make healthy indoor environments again. And I think hospitals really are the first place where this needs to change, because ironically, the worst place to heal is in a hospital. It is the worst environment you could possibly be. They always have cell towers on the top. They always have the worst lighting environments. And it's interesting, in my office, they have these horrible 4,000 Kelvin LED lights. And I asked my boss, why did you choose those lights for these office? Because the other rooms have, the kitchen and the waiting room have warmer lights. And he said, well, because they told me the white lights, the bluer ones look more professional. So, there's no understanding at all as to the health effects of this. And it's funny because we're a respiratory lab. One of the things that we know about blue light is it causes hypoxia. It's hilarious. It's so ironic that we are putting patients with respiratory problems into environments that directly cause hypoxia at the cellular level. It is a joke that this is where we're at, but people are working quite hard to change it. Guys like Sean Kane at Monash, he wrote a paper basically saying that any doctor working in a hospital is essentially breaking their Hippocratic oath by using the lighting in the hospitals. They are doing harm. So I'm looking forward to seeing where that goes. But I think at the end of the day, it's got to start with the architects, and we need intelligent biologists and physicians to talk to the architects and let them know how serious the problem is.
Yeah. And it might be a bit of a sensitive topic, but it's got to start somewhere. And but it is exciting. Yeah. And at least we know that the conversations are starting to come out about it as well. So if more people have conversations and more people are talking about it, then we can start to kind of make headway with it. But so so how can people get in touch with you, Cameron? I know you've got your also fantastic podcast called Ricky Flow Nutrition, which I actually thought that was your name when I first came across your podcast, but I understand where it came from now. But how can people get hold of you if they're wanting to learn more about your podcast and the work that you're doing?
Yeah, so I'm probably more accessible through Instagram, but my podcast is the Ricky Flow Nutrition podcast. I'll be uploading a lot this year, hopefully. Instagram is primarily where I share information. I've just started my Twitter. I don't know if I really understand it enough to use it really well. So Instagram, I have a website, Ricky Flow Nutrition. You can find it all through my Instagram, and you can go from there. But I'll hopefully be quite busy this year. So keep in touch if you want to learn more.
Brilliant. Well, this has been a really enlightening and refreshing conversation, Cameron. I'm so appreciative that you took the time to come on and talk to me about these topics that might be a little bit controversial in some ways, but they're conversations that we need to have because things aren't working. We're going down a very bad path, and we need to sort of put a bit of a something in the spokes to stop it from continuing going down that way. And your work is certainly doing that. You're certainly creating more awareness with amazing conversations that you're having also on your podcast. So thank you again for joining me.
Thank you for the invitation. It's always quite a pleasure to be on the other end of the questions rather than asking them myself. I feel quite special.
Terrific. Well, that's it for today's edition of the Healthy Shift Worker podcast. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us. Please, if you feel that there's some benefit from the conversation that we've had, feel free to share it with another shift worker, as it does help me to reach more people and help other shift workers like yourself.
We really hope you enjoyed that conversation. Thanks so much for listening. Feel free to share the episode with any of your friends, family, or colleagues who you think may benefit from the discussion too. If you'd like to learn more strategies on how to work around the clock and stay healthy too, head on over to thehealthyshiftworker.com for more information.